masonette on a small housing estate in Hertfordshire, a few miles north of London, seems an unlikely place to find the influences of forest gardening. But the combination of Mike Guerra's design and Julia's practical application has created a tiny garden which is enormously productive. A small but significant contribution to the challenge of growing food locally.
You look at what in the world around us and you think everything is going to hell and you don't know what to do about it. But all of a sudden somebody says, think global but act local. Fundamental to that. And what is more local than producing food for yourself? If you don't food produce for yourself, then somebody else is going to have to do it for you and use energy to do it. I had no idea how to grow any food. I had no idea about gardening. I was 30 years old before I realized how to grow food. And then I saw the Visionaries program with Bill Mollison on Channel 4, and all of a sudden it was illumination. It seemed so easy. He was just walking around eating from his garden. There was no supermarket in between. There was no heavy lorries. There was no intensive use of poison. It was just there. It was in his garden. He was just walking around eating it. It was really that wonderful. And because you don't have any preconceptions about gardening, all of a sudden it becomes easy. Why isn't anybody else doing like that? And that's the approach we took. We grasped that with both hands and went out and turned our rubble-filled garden into what you see today. And it was easy. It was really easy. The other fundamental part of it was the idea that instead of just growing an allotment in our back garden, that we had that there was an opportunity to turn a two-dimensional landscape into a three-dimensional food-producing place. And one of the most important ways one of the most important inspirations for us was Robert Hart's forest garden, because everything is multi-layered, because everything is working together, everything is compact, everything has to be close together to work together. That it became an important part of designing a small garden. If you don't go out with that attitude, saying, well, I can put in more in less area, and say, well, I'm just lazy, I can only do this little bit here, then the garden will fail because there isn't that close interaction, that close polyculture, that close diversity, which makes it all work like it does in nature. And nature is the biggest teacher. If you don't keep your eyes open, you'll never learn anything.
When we first moved into this ground floor masonette, the back garden was completely paved. There was nothing there at all. And we had a side area of garden that was just lawn with a very invasive conifer tree, and the front garden was just purely lawn as well. So we decided we would start with the back garden, as that was the most unobtrusive and we could really have an experiment with that and find out what we wanted to do.
Learn gardening from scratch.
So to start with, we wanted to use what we had, so we decided to take up a lot of the pavings, stand them on their ends and create raised beds immediately by cementing bricks at the corners. We had to actually import a lot of the soil mix,
essentially all of it.
Soil, yes, because unfortunately with a lot of these new built houses there is no layer of soil underneath. It was just sand and builder's rubble, and it was impossible to dig into or do anything with it. So we abandoned that idea straight away, and through borrowing and begging materials from other people.
Any rough organic matter that we had
manure,
sand. We actually bought sand. We actually bought some manure. The most important thing for us, at least, to get the soil working was a little 3 bags of woodland soil with worms in it, woodland edge soil.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, if you go in the garden now and put your hands inside, you'll find there's a definite sponge structure, and it's there due to worms. We do no digging, and therefore we do no weeding. We do mulching on the surface. We let the worms do the work.
In the first season, we were actually able to grow a number of vegetables in this system. We were able to grow beans and potatoes and some salad vegetables, which was actually quite an achievement for us.
We read the back of the seed packets. That's the only we got to learn. It was only till later that we actually got books on gardening to see the husbandry of the different plants. But to get your hands dirty, get earth underneath the fingernails, to actually sow some seed and actually see it growing and for you to eat it, and then the bits that were left over you compost it. The cycle there was important for us to get motivated. All of a sudden you felt a real attachment to the earth. There was a real reason to continue. It wasn't just a complete waste of time and money. You realised we had something that was worth continuing with. And it wasn't until we actually tried it out for ourselves that we realised how wonderful it all was and how easy.
A quick glance round the garden makes it clear that Julia and Mike have absorbed a lot of influences. Techniques of conventional organic growing, permaculture design and forest gardening are all apparent. Putting together these ideas contributes to the success of cultivating so much in such a small space.
Permaculture and forest gardening are two different things, to us at least. Permaculture is basically a design methodology, a philosophy, an ethic, a way of designing your landscape. Whereas forest gardening is basically a technique. It's a method of using or designing a multi-layered food-producing or output-producing structure, whether it be medicinal plants or whatever. You can use a forest garden or the elements of that within a permaculture design. Permaculture is not about techniques, it's about strategy, it's about design. Most of our garden, because it's so small, is what we would call a zone 1, which is intensive vegetables, herbs, soft fruit. But we have forest garden elements within that. We grow runner beans up some of the trees with an open canopy. We grow things layered up in front of us so everybody gets an equal chance at the sunlight. Everybody will get an equal chance at the soil layer. It's a matter of increasing yield while in the same area. We use a number of different ways of doing it. We use the strawberry tower, for instance, a way of doubling our area of strawberries by just simply placing one layer in mid-air on a structure, leaving sufficient light to get into the bottom layer. But they're basically techniques and structures within a permaculture design.
We try to use companion planting where we can in our garden design. For instance, the well-known companion planting is marigolds with tomatoes or basil with tomatoes to keep away pests and flies. But we also find what's very successful is growing onions or garlic along with other plants. We have a bed that integrates onions, parsnips and carrots together, and we find that there is something within the onions that seems to keep away carrot root fly. Similarly, with our apple trees, we've had a lot of success in the forest garden areas with growing chives and also lots of herbs at the base of the apple trees.
Yes.
And we found that's very successful in keeping away all sorts of pests, and we have no problems with them at all.
You can see the hoverflies and ladybirds picking up pollen from the chives and from the other herbs, and then going off and laying their eggs. And you can then see the hoverfly and ladybird larvae eating the green fly on the apple trees. They're just adjacent. They're right there, and it's a really good companion. There's nothing mystical. There's nothing magical or unscientific about it. I mean, whether you believe in science or not, the results speak for themselves. You have a situation where the association is so apparent, then it's impossible to ignore it.
Ingenuity is the key to success in this tiny garden. Rotting compost generates heat, and this can be cleverly used to dry shallots or germinate seedlings. Even in the warm, insulated space above the compost bins, squashes or melons can be grown. But what of crops like potatoes, which normally require a large space to reach maturity?
Growing potatoes in tiers is a really good way of growing a large crop in a small area. It's a bit more intensive than the normal potato growing method. But what you can do is you can use horse manure 3 times, and you can also grow more potatoes in the same area than you would otherwise. Simply, we use the freshly composted horse manure that we've used to heat up the hot box. We take it out and we put layers. We put the seed potatoes on newspaper at the bottom of the first tire, put this rough compost around it. As the potato plant grows above the first tire, we put another tire on, more compost in, another tire, more compost in, until you've basically filled 3 or 4 tires. Then you let the tubers grow off the side shoots of the main stem, which the potato plant will do. And you end up with 10 to 20 pounds of potatoes, depending on variety, depending on the growing conditions. And you have a really friable potting compost from the horse manure at the end of it. So you've used the horse manure 3 times, and you've got potatoes to boot.
The use of old tyres and redundant railway sleepers makes waste into a resource. Similarly, household scraps become useful items in the cycle of creating fertility.
The wormery is very useful to us indeed. Basically, all of our kitchen waste goes straight into the worm bin. It's very close, obviously, to the kitchen, just outside the back door. And we probably extract the material from it maybe once, possibly twice a year. It's very good for the compost itself. It's good for making a mix, potting compost or putting onto the garden. And we find we get a very good liquid drained from the worm compost.
Worm pea's jolly good.
Yes, actually we mix with water, and certainly for feeding tomatoes and those sort of plants at this time of the year, really gives them a good fillip.
Indeed, indeed. There's a lot of people seem to have a problem with wormeries. They either let them get too wet or too dry, or don't feed them often enough, or give them too many acid things. The trick is that we get our bread from the local bakers. He gives it to us in a bag, paper bag. We shred the bag, we put it in every time we buy a loaf of bread, 3 or 4 times a week. We also give a little bit of newspaper sometimes, sort of odd pieces of paper. A little bit of calcified seaweed is jolly useful if you like us eat a lot of chilies and onions and things like that, which are probably the worms don't find that digestible. But basically keeping the acid level down is really important, and making sure there's sufficient moisture retentive capacity. You can drain off the worm pit at the bottom regularly, and that keeps it down, but also adding woody material occasionally, and newspaper is really useful, any sort of paper product, because it absorbs some of the liquid, it makes it more friable, the worms have an easier time of it, and it doesn't get hot.
The design, the ingenuity, the fertility are all there for anyone to see. But doesn't it amount to a lot of hard work, and is it really as productive as it looks?
We produce on our 75 metres squared about 400 to 500 pounds, which is about 250 kilos of food a year for the kitchen. That sort of works out at about 15 tonnes an acre, which is better than agricultural land. We do this with only 2 hours work in the garden a week. Indeed. We do not do any digging, we don't do any weeding. We just basically sow, maintain, and eat. We wanted to show that people could have a real life, but not be completely sort of tied and exhausted by producing food.
Obviously what we try to do is get as much range of produce over as many months as possible. It is difficult in the winter because our main growing area at the back garden is in fact north facing, which makes it very difficult, so we do actually have just a few hardy crops through the winter. But on average we manage to have produce for ourselves from about the middle of May all the way through to October. I mean, that gives us quite a lot of produce.
We even have some salads that grow over winter.
Yes,
we have little bits of greens here and now and again, which are really important to maintain sort of vitality. If you don't have green vegetables during the winter, you can feel very lackluster, and it's wonderful to have a bit of lamb's lettuce or a bit of rocket or a bit of overwintering chard, or some of the Japanese vegetables seems to survive some sort of frosting. Yes. It's really vital to have that sort of energy, or raw vegetable energy during the winter. Otherwise, winter becomes hell.
About 90% of our produce we will actually eat straight away. Although we get a lot of different things, there's usually not a glut of any one thing. Occasionally we can freeze some things. Runner beans obviously can be frozen, and we can eat them possibly almost up to Christmas, which is good. We do sometimes get a slight glut of fruit, mainly sort of the soft fruit, raspberries, blackberries, and we actually make some jams. And I'm quite keen on using a lot of the herbs to make some vinegars for the kitchen use. So even in the months when we don't get fresh produce from the garden, there is usually something in the house that we've made.
We also store some vegetables. We store potatoes, onions, shallots, squashes, marrows, that sort of thing, which we have a small storage area for. But because we have to eat them fast because the storage area is within the house, therefore they're not cool enough. We have to eat those sort of by Christmas or in the middle of January. We don't really have a full year's produce.
At the moment.
At the moment.